Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to Environmental Law Society's annual legislative panel. We're thrilled to have you all here this evening. Clearly, we have refreshments over in the corner, so please help yourselves, make yourselves comfortable. We're thrilled for the speakers we have lined up, so without further ado, I will introduce our moderator for the evening, Daniel Lee.
Good evening. My name is Daniel Lee. It's my privilege to be your moderator this evening. The subject of tonight's panel is how to achieve successful environmental laws and solve environmental issues with decreasing room for compromise and negotiation. As you may have heard, the United Nations report on climate change issued Monday of this week unequivocally states that a dangerous climate threshold is near, but it does not mean we are doomed if swift action is taken. Effective environmental laws are needed now more than ever, but if they can't get passed or they become too watered down, the results could be disastrous. So, how do we pass effective environmental laws with little room for error? Tonight, let's answer that question and more. We will first hear from Rebecca Ramos with the Necrason Group, a political consultant, then Rob Hayes, Director of Clean Water for Environmental Advocates New York, followed by Paul Burns, Executive Director of the Vermont Public Interest Research Group, or VPIRG. Next, Connecticut Representative Christine Palm, who serves on the House Environment Committee and helped pass the Connecticut Clean Air Act. And finally, we have Josh King, Associate Director of the Langdon Group, specializing in environmental dispute resolution. Each panelist will speak for about 25 minutes, with a few minutes reserved at the end of their time for audience questions. For those of you online, please put your questions in the chat. For those of you in person, please raise your hand and one of our ambassadors will assist you. Let's kick things off with the Vermont Law alumni, Rebecca Ramos.
Hello, and I am so excited to be with you all here tonight. Some of you may know me because usually I, every year, speak to all the brand new students as they are introduced to the Vermont State House, usually like before school starts. So I hopefully won't be repeating myself because I got a list of questions that were all very good. And let me just start a little bit about myself. My name is Rebecca Ramos. I graduated in '97 with a joint degree. Love Vermont Law School, changed my life. My third year, I did an SIP with a law firm, included tracking at the State House. And there I learned that that is exactly the type of lawyer I wanted to be. Since that time, I've worked in a governor's office, chief of staff in the Senate. About 8 years ago, I moved to another alum, Adam Necrason, to his lobbying firm, and we're a contract lobbying firm. We work on many different issues. I'm the lucky one that mostly get to work on a lot of environmental, climate, and energy issues. So I realize a lot of you all probably follow the federal legislation and what's happening at the federal level. We really only focus on the Vermont level, and we are sort of the Vermont experts on the executive and legislative branches. So I think it might be helpful, based on the questions I got, to really talk a little bit about Vermont's political landscape. Because if you are trying to pass strong environmental laws, you have to understand the environment, the political environment that you're in. If you don't have a good understanding of that, you're not going to know how to work on your messaging, who you should be in your coalition, who should you be your messengers. Because as much as, when I used to think like the legislative process was this magical place, and it always ends up on the right side, and it's always like the right thing is always going to happen. And the reality is, it takes tons of organizing, being very smart and strategic, and working really hard to get good legislation, to get strong legislation.
Can I ask you a question about that?
Mhm.
So how have politics impacted the success of legislation in Vermont? And what type of political barriers exist for us to satisfy our climate and biodiversity goals?
Okay, well, so in Vermont, we have a Republican. So the political landscape question is what I think it's important to understand. Like in Vermont, you have a Republican governor and you have a legislature that's super Democratic majorities. Okay, and so if we can be, and so often I'm representing most often I'm representing the side that wants to be more aggressive, to push for change, to make stronger environmental laws. And the reality is we have in the legislature the ability to do that, but we're tempered by a Republican governor who's not interested in doing that. And so right now, when we, like just now, we had our second reading of the biodiversity bill, which y'all probably are familiar with. Our goal passing that bill was to make sure we had over 100 votes. Before, our number was 76. Now we're at 100. Our second reading, we just got 108 votes for a pretty, we picked up picked up at least one Republican, but we got all the independents and the progressives also. And so the understanding your political landscape will help how you move bills forward. And if we look in like specifically the climate arena, starting with the global warming. So I work a lot with actually some of the folks. There's Paul Burns, gave me a thumbs up. I work with Paul Burns on a lot of the climate strategy. And we had, before the Global Warming Solutions Act, we had other bills, policies we were trying to push, did not get a lot of traction on that. And so what we ended up working with a very high functioning chair in the Energy Committee, and we moved something called the Global Warming Solutions Act. We were able, once again, because of the governor who wasn't going to be supporting it, we had to build a bill that we could get 100 votes on. And that's very different than building a bill that you need 76 votes for. And so so often it is building coalitions, who you're bringing in the coalitions, how you get the independents, how you bring sometimes you have moderate Democrats who are concerned about their seats, how getting them comfortable with what you're doing. And I want to say for every environmental legislation, you have to understand the kitchen table aspect of it. Whether it was a climate issue or a forestry issue or a water issue, we have to understand how it impacts Vermont's kitchen table and what does it mean to Vermonters.
When you're dealing with a wide spectrum of environmental issues, are the interests that you see from the opposition relatively uniform, or do they differ? It depends on the issue. So like for something like changes to Act 250, and we have been trying to, because around forest issues, we have been trying to change some jurisdiction and criteria around to protect large forest blocks. And pretty much private developers, property owners, they don't trust or like Act 250. And so always usually on that Act 250, you're going to have the same making Act 250 stronger. You're generally going to have the same people. Other issues, it just going to depend. But I just want to say, unlike other subject areas, environmental laws are some of the hardest to pass in the building. And that is because it's not a value that people understand. Like when you're working on gay marriage, that was about love. We're not a particularly religious state. So it really was like, let those people do their thing. Here, we're talking about people's property. We're talking about their water. We're talking about their ability to build something. And so they see it as an attack on their rights. It slows down things that they want to do. And so
a environmental laws are, I actually think, the hardest. It's easier, I think, sometimes to pass a tax than it is to work to pass really strong environmental laws.
Excellent. And as a lobbyist, do your approaches, process, and methods differ when confronting environmental issues versus other issues?
So the type of critical thinking about how we approach a problem is often the same, right? Because it's a general sense of like who's with us, what leadership is with us, who's our champion. So questions about how you build a campaign, how you build a coalition, who your champions are, how to grow champions, who's against you. But the actual, how you choose, at our office, we always talk about winning on the merits. Like, how do you bring the merits to constituents to bring with you, or to, often there are many different messengers that legislators need to hear from. They don't need to hear from me. They need to hear from their constituents. They need to hear from other legislators. They need to hear from the lieutenant governor or the AG. And so all the tactics are very similar. How they're applied and what they look like on the ground can be different.
Excellent. And for those of us that are interested in entering the field of lobbying, what are some of the most common and significant mistakes that environmentalists make when lobbying? And do you have any advice on how to avoid that?
So in law school and right out, I did a ton of protesting and very angry about, I grew up in a community that was really ravaged by overdevelopment in a beach town, and so I came from a place of a deep feeling and being outraged at how the natural world was not cared for or protected. And so what I've learned over all these years is that sometimes you need outrage and sometimes you don't need outrage, and sometimes you need to show up one way. So there's a lot of how do you show up in a space, and so sometimes it's an emotional space. The other thing is, I was just having a conversation the other day with a client who's a scientist, and she had all this great data on this thing that she's trying to do, and she almost put me to sleep. And I was like, nobody is going to care about that data, right? Nobody wants to see you super angry, but nobody's going to care about that data. So what I really need is a story, and I need you to tell me why it's important to you, but not to the point where you're indicting me for not acting. And so it's really this combination of being passionate at the same time, understanding the facts, but telling your story why it's meaningful and authentic, an authentic, meaningful story, but being well prepared. Often we start with our, this stuff, and that just turns people off.
Thank you. I know that you mentioned that you don't necessarily do a lot of work with federal politics, but you mentioned that it's of high importance to understand the political landscape here in Vermont. And I think most of us kind of get our dose of politics through what we see in the news and on social media. What does the political landscape really look like here in Vermont, and how does it differ from what we're consuming?
Right. So generally, the political landscape here is a more friendly, accessible place. There is not strident anger or frustration at Republicans and Democrats get along, the House and Senate get along with the governor, they're friendly to each other. There's no outrageous, angry feelings that you don't see that. Often committees have 11-0 votes where the majority party makes room for the minority party to get things that they want. On environmental issues, that's not always the case. We are really hot button issue for certain more right-leaning folks who just feel like often we are taking their, like we're, you know, we're taking something from them, or we're slowing something down, and that it's not fair, and that, you know, it's overwrought and too much government and things like that.
Kind of following on that, do you have a way to coalesce that kind of divergence and feelings about the environment? Or an approach?
Yeah, so, you know, I always assume, so in our office, we always talk about there are people who are against us, people are neutral, or people are with us, right? And so if people are against us, we try to bring them to neutral so that they don't, you know, try to beat us down like on the floor. And if people are neutral, we try to bring them to yes. And so the reality, often when there are some people, so there are going to be some people who are always going to be against us. And sometimes the environmental community and even other advocates, they will just not go talk to the people who disagree with them. And those are some of my favorite people to talk to. Like, we have a responsibility and an obligation to go tell our story. Sometimes, you know, not all the time. Sometimes they're just, you can't access them. I never give up on people. And we've had over time, like, people who we thought were going to be against us, just be like, you know what, I'm just going to go talk and see. Oh, and I found out their son's a forester. Oh, guess what? You find out about them. Oh, you know, don't make, like, I try to not make rash judgments about people or how they're going to show up. And I always try to, you know, bring the merits to them and then hear what they have to say.
That's quite insightful. I appreciate that. Thank you. What direction do you see administrative or legislative developments going in Vermont?
So, you know, right now we're in the fourth term of our governor, and he does not want any environmental regulation. If in the opposite, he's about loosening it. And so anything that we're bringing to him, we're doing so with 100 votes. The Vermont often in this area is always pushing the edge. And so we can't often in this area, we become a place where the nation likes to try things. Can we do it here in Vermont? When we look at like toxins or, you know, different other types of sort of harder types of bills to pass where you have a large industrial base and a lot of industry. We don't really have that here. So we have a capacity to push things that maybe we can't in other places. Right now with our current governor, it's harder to do those things. And so, but even with, you know, even with so many Democrats, they start breaking off into smaller caucuses, and it's not like some monolithic thing. There's a ton of, you know, like they all have a very different view. So it's not just like some monolith that you know, if they're a Democrat, they're voting for you.
Excellent. And I apologize for deviating from the script, but
That's
do
okay.
you have maybe an example that you could share with us, if you're able, about an issue that you lobbied for and what the process was like trying to approach the opposition, and where you met with them, and maybe what you found effective to address them, whether it was in the legislature's cafeteria or elsewhere?
Yeah. So sometimes, okay, Vermont in particular, and this is going to be very different in other places, but we're very small here in Vermont. And sometimes other lobbyists, advocates, you know, folks will have a sense that they're not welcome or they're not going to get a fair hearing in this committee. And so being able to reach out to, you know, we had a situation on this bill, the biodiversity bill that just passed. I mean, it just had second reading on the floor. There were certain folks who felt like they weren't being heard in the Energy and Environment Committee. Energy Environment would have said, well, no, we welcome them in, and they chose not to come. But these folks felt like, and this is like some of the, forest industry, forester folks, they felt like because they knew the chair and they knew some of the members in there, that whatever they said, they weren't going to be listened to. And so they, so they asked to have sort of a hearing over in House Ag, where they felt like they would be more heard. And so all that was based on reputation, based on assumptions about people, and probably not true at all. But we were able to work with House Ag. They were heard, and then we were able to do an amendment on House Ag that House Environment and Energy agreed to, and we brought along part of the Rural Caucus and a group of other folks who would have been who opposed this bill before. So it's that sort of stuff, like being a good listener, trying to understand people's concerns, not just saying, you know what, we tried to have them in and they didn't come. Like, that's not how. You got to keep pushing to try to understand what's happening. My job is to get to 100, not worry, not get caught up in like how people are feeling.
Is there a secret to being persistent but not annoying? Or maybe annoying is good.
It's an instinct, really. I see people go past that all the time.
Excellent. Before we jump to our audience questions, do you have any advice for those that are interested in getting into lobbying or perhaps a position in the executive branch?
It's a relationship space. So if it is something you want to do, you need to, do an SIP and start meeting folks, as you know, right? Because that's how I met you, is like through a nonprofit organization. So like working with, there's a ton of environmental energy nonprofits, working through that space, getting to know people. That's how I ended up working in the governor's office, was just working in the building, people getting to know me, seeing that I work hard. I mean, you do have to work hard, and, we're like 12, 14-hour days right now. Like, I'm headed back to the State House after this.
That's very impressive, and we appreciate your dedication. We have a few questions, I think, from those participating in the audience and online. Here in the front.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I have a question. Thank you so much for your offering to be here and offering your expertise. I did have a question. So when you think of some of the environmental issues that face Vermont, or specifically, I guess, Vermont's biggest sector for carbon emissions is transportation. So when you take a state like Vermont, it's where it's very rural for the most part, and one town is spread far from the next. What are some of the challenges that the legislature and those advocating for certain laws take into consideration that also balance equity concerns when it comes to, first of all, transportation and electrifying the fleet, Vermont's fleet, and making sure that's actually realistic with the landscape of Vermont?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And the transportation sector is the carbon emissions from the transportation sector will be the hardest place for us to reduce our emissions. That is what's real, because we are so rural, and because we can't just start creating like, people have to move around. They don't have a ton of money. They're not just going to go buy an EV. And our transportation agency, even though they're like some of the most progressive transportation agencies in the country, transportation agencies were often called, were like the automobile agencies. They were really about building roads and bridges. And so this is an issue I've worked on for transportation policy for like 25 years. And so the part of what has to change is the culture of the agency itself, which is changing. We have, I mean, talking about, I'm not familiar if you're familiar with complete streets and those concepts 20 years ago or when it first started, nobody wanted to do it. They didn't think it was a good idea. Why do we have to put sidewalks everywhere? Now this long time, this radical incrementalism that we talk about, like we just had one of the most positive language in the T-belt ever on complete streets, but it's taken a lot of time for the transportation agency people to see why it is really a part of what they're doing when they're redoing or building new roads and bridges. The state is putting a ton of money into EV charging. There's going to be a ton of resources through the IRA and other places to be able to get electric vehicles. It's not going to be enough, and the equity issues are real. So it is not. This is an area that there's still got to be a ton of work on.
Thank you very much. Do we have a question in the chat?
Representative Palm has a question.
By all
Hey,
means.
guys. Yes. Hi, guys. Thank you. I'm Christine Palm. I'm a state legislator from Connecticut, and I'm going to be speaking later, and I don't want to take Rebecca's time. I just want to say, hey, Rebecca, thank you. Sounds like you're doing everything right. I wish we had more people like you here in Connecticut. I wanted to make a quick response to that last question that you just fielded. Connecticut isn't quite as rural as Vermont. By the way, I graduated from Goddard, so I love Vermont. But we do have rural areas in Connecticut. And one of the ways that I would suggest that you and all the climate activists approach that problem of lack of transit is to remember that old people and poor, we do have rural poor. It's not just cities and millennials that need and want mass transit, but old folks who give up their license need to get to their doctor's offices. And in Connecticut, we have this great little mini fleet, little mini buses of it's called 9-Town Transit. And whenever people start to express anti-environmental sentiment, I remind them that's your grandmother who can't get to her chemotherapy appointment. That's the person that you're depriving of transportation when you get rid of this little energy efficient bus. So I would just say to all of you guys, think beyond the box of urbanism, which of course I love, and millennial desire to have environmentalism, which of course I love, because there are older people who don't consider themselves environmentalists, and certainly the rural poor, including those people who have this aggrieved notion that they're forgotten. We need to scoop them up and have them be part of the solution. So it sounds like you're already halfway there, and I just want to thank you again for your great work.
I think that ties in nicely with Ms. Ramos' advice for trying to put together a story and make it personable in order to relate to the opposition. And thank you for that excellent insight, Representative Palm. For any other panelists that are joining us on Zoom during our time at the end, feel free to just turn on your mic and ask questions. And thank you for joining us this evening, Ms. Ramos. It's quite exciting to see a VLS grad making monumental improvements in our state government. I expect you will soon see many of the faces here tonight around the legislature and the governor's office assisting you in your outstanding efforts. Let's give a round of applause to Rebecca Ramos.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
Next, we have Rob Hayes, Director of Clean Water at Environmental Advocates New York, an organization that fights for policies to restore and protect New York's environment while supporting healthy and vibrant communities and securing benefits and outcomes for all. Based in Albany, Mr. Hayes lobbies for strong state-level legislation and regulations to protect clean water from source to tap. He leads numerous statewide advocacy coalitions and provides support to residents in communities directly impacted by water pollution. Rob's recent coalition victories include historic levels of state funding for water infrastructure upgrades and the establishment of nation-leading drinking water standards for toxic PFAS chemicals. Live from New York, it's Rob Hayes.
Thank you, Dan. Great to be here.
Excellent.
I should have had a joke to start out with if I knew you were going to do an SNL opening.
Always expect the unexpected, Rob. And thank you for joining us. I'd first like to ask you, what was your role in securing state funding for water infrastructure upgrades and standards for toxic chemicals?
Sure, and maybe to start as an answer for that, I can give a little bit more background on my organization. I know you covered some of it in your opening, but really, we're an organization based here in Albany, the state capital of New York, where our state government is located. And we at Environmental Advocates kind of focus on two main things. One is to be frontline lobbyists at the state capitol, so constantly talking to state legislators and state agency regulators to try and move policy through those bodies that will protect public health and further environmental justice. But not only are we lobbyists, we're also kind of advocates and organizers. Because of course, as I'm sure you all know, just because you have a great policy idea, it doesn't mean that it's going to get enacted. You need power behind it. And so we spend a lot of our time doing coalition building in every part of the state, finding partners whose interests align with ours, helping make sure that their voices, wherever they are being heard by their decision makers in Albany. We do a lot of media outreach and engagement, hosting press conferences, writing op-eds to really kind of build public awareness and support for the policies we're trying to push. And then as well, doing a lot of other kind of internal work to make sure that we're really functioning well as an organization. So that's some of the work that we do at EA as both organizers and advocates, and then as lobbyists. It's really great to kind of experience the whole spectrum of the advocacy process. And then you mentioned kind of work we've been doing recently on water infrastructure funding and toxic chemical regulation. So as I'm sure is the case in Vermont as well, but New York has incredibly old and aging water infrastructure. We have water mains that are 100 years old and sewage treatment plants whose concrete foundations are literally crumbling. And many drinking water treatment plants who do not have the most up-to-date technology to remove some of these new emerging contaminants from our drinking water. So given especially the federal disinvestment that we've seen from water infrastructure over the last several decades, which luckily has started to change at the federal level, we had really pushed New York State to step up and try and fill that gap. Because what we saw was many of these water infrastructure upgrades simply were not affordable for local governments and communities across the state. A lot of these local governments were already debt burdened. They couldn't afford these multi-million-dollar projects. So we began advocating for New York to develop its own state grant funding that could be provided for all these drinking water and wastewater treatment improvements. So we built a coalition comprising both the water utilities, labor unions across the state, environmental organizations, and we're able to kind of find some key allies in the legislature and the governor's office to get that enacted. I think that happened around 2015. And since then, we've driven almost $5 billion into water infrastructure investments here in New York. But I think a real testament to kind of coalition power. Environmentalists on their own might not have been able to secure that win. I think it was really the partnership, especially with labor, which is so influential in the state of New York, that really helped make that happen. And then I can touch on the toxic chemical piece that you mentioned as well. Here in New York, just like in Vermont, we've been heavily impacted by PFAS contamination. I know Hoosick Falls is right across the border from Vermont, which was our kind of big initial scandal when it came to PFAS contamination. Residents that were drinking water that was contaminated for decades and never knew it, and was seriously putting their health at risk. And so because of that and the kind of public attention and organizing that crisis in Hoosick Falls and in other places across the state kind of created, we've been able to win a lot more drinking water protections on PFAS here in New York. Established maximum contaminant levels on PFOA and PFOS back in 2020. Our Department of Health now has proposed regulations to regulate an additional 23 PFAS chemicals, which would be the most in the nation if we're able to get it done. And of course, we just got some great news from the US EPA that they're finally going to start taking action on PFAS, which is long, long overdue. But again, I think, a lot of wins on that front as a result of the amazing community organizing that was happening in some of these polluted communities. Decision makers really pay attention when folks in their districts stand up, when they have really compelling, emotional, personal stories to tell, and it makes an issue real for decision makers in a way that sometimes data on its own cannot do. So that's a bit of an overview of work that we've done on those two topics over the last few years. Happy to answer any follow-up questions if anything was still unclear.
Absolutely. I've always pronounced it PFAS, but thank you. I now know that it's PFAS. And touching on the recent federal developments from the EPA on PFAS, do you think that will solidify what you've accomplished in New York, or do you suspect that there might even be a preemption issue?
No, actually, we're thrilled about what EPA put forward. It was kind of amazing to see EPA follow the science kind of to the letter. It doesn't always happen at the EPA. So yeah, especially the maximum contaminant levels that they propose for PFOA and PFOS would really be about the lowest levels you could set MCLs for, down at 4 parts per trillion. That's actually where we've been pushing New York to go for a number of years now. And luckily, if EPA gets this enacted and finalized, our State Department of Health will be required to meet that new federal standard. Because of course, the states can't be weaker than the feds. They can be stronger than them, but certainly not weaker. Something that we're going to be pushing for now in New York is hopefully to convince our governor's office and Department of Health to try and implement those stronger EPA standards probably a lot more quickly than EPA might be able to implement them. I'm sure it's going to be a long rulemaking process at the federal level. There's probably going to be lawsuits that the chemical corporations submit to try and stop it. Whereas I think here in New York, we might be able to act much more quickly and hopefully get those stronger standards in place earlier, start getting cleaner water to people earlier. And hopefully then take action on a lot of those other PFAS chemicals that EPA hasn't been addressing yet. There's so many PFAS out there. We've got to start addressing them as a class. Otherwise, we'll just be playing whack-a-mole for hundreds of years.
Excellent. And it is really quite impressive and astounding what it is that you've been able to accomplish for the people of New York. But on the flip side, were you able to access and implement everything that you believe that the state needs?
Oh, definitely not. Otherwise, I would be out of a job. So thank goodness, polluted water still exists, right? No, it's, we are constantly having to advocate for new clean water protections, new ways to make sure that we're preventing contamination, other things like that. Even 5-10 years ago, nobody had PFAS on their radar here in New York. It certainly wasn't an environmental advocate New York's priority, kind of policy priority list. So those new challenges are constantly arising, and in part they're constantly arising because we have such a poor system of chemical regulation in this country. Industry does not have to prove that a chemical is safe before they're allowed to put it in products or dump it into our environment, and so we are constantly playing catch up. Potentially decades later, when scientists are able to study these chemicals, find a risk to human health, at that point, they're widespread, they're in our environment, and people are getting sick. So the hope is we can change both in New York, but especially at the federal level, and have a much more proactive approach to toxic chemical regulation. I think another area where New York has been lagging behind some other states is on the issue of lead pipe replacements. We have hundreds of thousands of lead pipes still buried underground in New York, still delivering drinking water to people, and they're causing a lot of contamination each and every day. We've seen states like Illinois, Michigan, New Jersey be much more proactive in putting forward mandates and funding to dig these pipes out of the ground. And it's something we're trying to get kind of more momentum on here in New York as well. There was actually just a city across the river from Albany, Troy, New York, again, fairly close to the Vermont border. You might know of it, where there was a recent scandal with lead in their drinking water and the city's failure to spend some previous grant money to replace lead pipes. We just convinced the city to develop a plan to achieve 100% lead pipe replacement over the next few years. That's what we got to be doing in every single community across New York and across the country, because the longer these pipes are in the ground, the greater the chance that we're going to have another contamination crisis.
Would you say that's the main equal access issue that you've encountered through this process, or were there others that you dealt with?
There are definitely a lot of kind of equal access and environmental justice intersections with the water work that we do. Definitely lead pipe replacements is a big one. These pipes are most likely to be found in low-income communities and communities of color. Oftentimes folks that can least afford to pay thousands of dollars to dig these pipes out of the ground. But definitely other intersections as well. We have, since the pandemic hit, started working more on issues of water affordability. Most people kind of think that water bills are affordable and that most people, pay their water bill every time they get it. But there's a lot of, very deeply impoverished New Yorkers and people across the country that can't afford that bill when it comes in the mail. And when they don't pay it, that means that their water could be shut off and they are denied access to this really fundamental human right. Or in some cases in New York, a lien could be placed on their home that could eventually lead to foreclosure. So again, denial of this really kind of basic human right to housing. So it's an issue that has not been on environmentalists' radar. Honestly, in the last several decades, I think there's a growing awareness of this problem, as well as issues of energy affordability as well. There's really no kind of, New York at least, kind of statewide policy or regulatory framework that's meant to ensure affordable water. Most water in New York is publicly owned, about 90% of it, thank goodness, and it's local government owned and operated. But that means that there's really no statewide regulations when it comes to how much water systems charge or what their policies are when somebody can't afford to pay their bill. It's really the Wild West out there. And so because of that, we still really don't have a good grasp of what is the scale and the extent of water affordability across New York. And one of the policies we're working on now is to try and collect that data from every single water utility in the state, working to get that through the legislature. So another area where the most vulnerable people in our state are the most impacted, and it's directly kind of correlated with their ability to access clean water.
Excellent. And one more on that topic of funding for water infrastructure upgrades. Were there issues that you had to compromise on? I assume that everything in the bill wasn't achieved just so you could keep your job. Did you have to make some compromises in order to get the legislation to where it is now? And how did you decide on where to make concessions?
Yeah, compromise is a part of almost every single advocacy campaign. I wish it wasn't. The amount that you have to compromise is usually kind of directly correlated, proportional. I don't know what the word is. The more power you have, the less you have to compromise, basically. And so that's why we try and build as powerful of campaigns as possible, so our opponents aren't able to weaken these policies that we know are really necessary to protect clean water. But one example of compromise we've done in recent years was we passed a bill through the state legislature back in 2021 to require universal testing for 40 different contaminants in drinking water, including, I think, 27 PFAS chemicals were on that list. That got through the legislature, but then we had to convince the governor to sign it. And in New York, excuse me, there's this process where sometimes the governor will kind of demand to negotiate changes to a bill before he or she signs it. And those changes to the bill will then be passed by the legislature the following session in what's known as a chapter amendment. So really in New York, we both have to go through a process of getting the bill through a legislature, but then it's almost another hurdle we have to kind of get through to see what kind of negotiations we have to go through with the governor's office. So in this case, the governor wanted to weaken the bill. She was concerned about costs from doing this testing and the kind of logistics of doing that across the state. And so we ended up compromising, I think 23 chemicals were included on the final list, all PFAS chemicals, with then the additional chemicals kind of pushed for further discussion by state agencies into future years. So an area where, we had to kind of make a game time decision about, is what is left in this bill enough to justify, or do we just have to call it a day, take a veto, and come back next year? In that situation, we decided, to start testing for 23 PFAS chemicals statewide. That was worth taking the win.
Absolutely. That's both insightful and quite impressive. Thank you. It seems like environmental coalitions are quite integral in order to assuring that these movements become successful and actualize. How could grassroots movements become more effective for filling in legislative gaps at the state and even the federal level, if you have any insight on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And grassroots mobilization is so important. When decision makers can hear directly from their constituents, it makes a huge difference. I think honestly, just more investment from the environmental movement and from funders who fund the environmental movement to doing grassroots organizing would go a long way. We just need more environmental organizers. There are a lot of policy people like me that the environmental movement funds, and honestly, we could probably use less of me. And we could probably use more organizers on the ground, talking to communities, engaging communities, because that's really where power is built. And I think you see, in the most successful social and economic movements in New York, that's where their power really derives from. The labor movement is incredibly powerful in New York because they've got a grassroots union membership base. The housing movement, very powerful in New York because they have done an incredible job organizing tenants over decades and building that kind of people power in New York City, but also elsewhere in other upstate cities across the state. So honestly, just more investment, I think, is needed in the environmental movement into that sphere of advocacy and political work.
Having extra funding, I suppose, does seem like it would fix the problem, and it seems perhaps like an overly simple solution. Is there ways that those of us here that are interested could implement more effective organization on the ground if we weren't able to access that extra funding? Or alternatively, do you have advice for us on how we might be able to access more funding in order to be more effective?
Both great questions. Well, one I'd say, wherever you are living, there's the potential to do community organizing. You'll have contacts where you live, your friends, your families, your neighbors, see where there might be gaps in your community, where policy might need to be changed to make sure that every single person is guaranteed, a clean and safe environment and human dignity. It's those kind of interpersonal connections that you probably already have to your daily life that is really the kind of foundation, I think, of organizing, and that everything kind of grows and builds from that. In terms of the funding side, it's difficult to say. There are a lot of foundations out there, granting to environmental work. I think more of them are starting to recognize the importance of grassroots organizing and advocacy. I think especially we've seen this in the climate movement recently, and the success of grassroots efforts like the Sunrise movement that has really, I think, shifted the climate conversation to a much better place. And it'd be great to have more of that action in the water space as well.
Excellent. Thanks for putting up with me pressing on you a little bit. How have you been working to implement and enforce environmental policies that protect and prepare New York for climate change with respect to issues like sea level rise and access to resources or depletion of resources?
Yeah, lot of action in New York on this recently. Probably the biggest effort has been an initiative called the Environmental Bond Act. So last November 2022, and actually I should go back before that. So in 2022, the state legislature and governor passed an Environmental Bond Act as part of the state budget. This was a $4.2 billion initiative to really build climate resiliency. It had funding in there for wetland protection and stream restoration and water infrastructure upgrades where that infrastructure was really at risk from extreme flooding, as well as kind of climate mitigation efforts to continue our shift towards a fully fossil-free economy. So anyway, but just because that cleared the legislature and the governor in 2022 wasn't the only hurdle for that. It then went before voters in November when we had our election. And amazingly, it passed with 2/3 support of New Yorkers that came out to vote that day. So that funding has now been approved. New York is just kind of taking the first steps to start to roll that funding out. It's going to be a many-year process to get it out the door. But it's a hugely important effort to be funding those kind of climate resilient solutions that we know that we're going to need over the next couple of decades. And, you know, I think the vote on the Environmental Bond Act really showed the bipartisan support that environmental action continues to have. It's one of the few issues, I think, that can command those kind of majorities. Though I will say, and the coalition was very intentional about this, they really emphasized kind of the clean water messaging as part of that Bond Act. The Bond Act was actually called the Clean Water, Clean Air, and Green Jobs Bond Act. Clean water hold a lot better than, say, kind of climate change or climate resiliency messaging. Didn't mean that that messaging was underwater in terms of the polls, but they found the kind of messaging on clean water got them to that higher level support that they knew they would need when it came to election day. So, you know, thinking back to how we sell these policies too, you know, the messaging we use, really, really critical.
That's really quite fascinating. Has the market opened up for these environmental bonds, or have you just laid the groundwork for it?
Just the groundwork at this point. I think the agencies are now kind of putting forward their plans for how they're going to get that money out the door. So I don't think they've gone to the bonding agencies yet, but hoping that comes probably at this point post legislative session for us, probably in the summer, we'll start to see that rolled out.
That's quite exciting, and I look forward to hearing more about that. I learned about bonds from the best. You may or may not see Brian Lee here on the Zoom chat. That's my father. He worked in bonds for many years and taught me all about them.
Oh, very nice.
So it sounds like a really fascinating and exciting solution. Certainly, would you call that kind of like a hybrid solution between the public and the private sectors?
That's an interesting question. It might actually test my knowledge of bonds and the bond market. My understanding is this will all be state funding, that $4.2 billion. It's all going to be grant funding. It's not loan dollars at all. So, you know, state grants, definitely important to keep stuff affordable for communities. How that relates to the kind of bond market, outside of my wheelhouse, to be perfectly honest.
Excellent. And I have just one more for you before we jump to some audience questions, which is, how does your NGO interact with the legislature? What does that process look like?
Yeah, so we're lobbyists. I'm a lobbyist. I'm a registered New York State lobbyist. And so that means that most session days in New York, and the New York State legislative session runs from January through June. Most session days, I am down at the state capitol, and I am talking to legislators about the priorities that we want to move that session. What bills do we want them to pass through committee and on the floor? What funding do we need to see in the state budget? I was actually just at a press conference earlier this morning, trying to get more funding for lead pipe replacement in our state budget that's due on April 1st. So really, we kind of track and follow every step of that legislative process. from drafting legislation to identifying sponsors, working with them to introduce it, moving bills through the committee process till eventual floor votes, and then doing the work to actually get those bills signed and enacted by the governor. So, really, really close relationship with the legislature. It helps a lot that we're in Albany and can be here in person. And honestly, a big perk of the job that I get to spend a lot of my time in the beautiful New York State Capitol.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Do we have any questions from those in the audience, both in person and online? We have one over here. You, sir.
Hi, yes, thank you so much for being here and taking the time to do this. My question, you sort of touched on this a little bit about the nexus of your work with environmental justice populations and how clean water access is a large challenge. Can you speak a little bit to how your organization maybe helps identify those populations and how you are working to pick where those improvements in pipe access or just water infrastructure is happening in environmental justice populations?
Great question. I think I'm going to answer that in two parts. One is, we work a lot with communities that have been directly impacted by water pollution, and probably where we've most done that recently is with communities facing PFAS contamination. And what we often find is that a community finds PFAS in their water, they might exceed the state standards, and kind of people on the ground have never heard of PFAS before. They don't know the steps that are entailed to get their water cleaned up, who they need to talk to, what this all means for them and their family, what they should be doing to protect their health. And so a lot of what we try and do is connect with different community members or community organizations and help provide them the technical resources that they need to better understand what's going on with their water, so they can understand what can they be advocating for when it comes to their city government, their state government, their federal government, to make sure that their situation is remediated as quickly as possible. So it's one of the most rewarding aspects of this work is getting to work with those community members, because they're doing such amazing work on the ground, and to get to support them and lift them up is just absolutely incredible. But then in terms of, I think the other part of your question, which was how do we make sure that resources get to those communities that need them most? It's definitely something we're working on in New York, but a lot more needs to be done. Something that New York has recently started implementing from a policy perspective is having, when thinking about environmental funding, mandating a percentage of that funding that has to be provided to what in New York are called disadvantaged communities. This began with the kind of landmark climate law that we passed in 2019 that said we have to be 80% off of fossil fuels by 2050, with the other 20%, I think, as an offset. And what that law said was at least 35% of the funds that are dedicated to that transition of our energy system and economy has to benefit disadvantaged communities. And the state over the last year or two has been working up a definition of a disadvantaged communities to be implemented in accordance with that climate law. Something I didn't mention with the Environmental Bond Act that just passed here in New York is that same criteria is built into the Bond Act. So at least 35% of that Bond Act funding for climate resiliency, for water infrastructure improvements, has to be provided to disadvantaged communities. This is all pretty new in New York, and I think it's going to take a lot of watchdogging in terms of the implementation to make sure that that promise is actually fulfilled and those dollars do reach communities. But that's one way from the policy side that we've tried to make sure that vulnerable communities are receiving their fair share of resources, because they've been denied it for way too long.
Thank you so much. We have time for just one more audience question. The young lady here in the front.
Hi, so I did have a question about clean water infrastructure, and I just am wondering to what extent, so when we had the event, the scandal in Flint, Michigan occur, there was just this mass public outrage. And I guess my question has to do with education. I mean, knowing how polluted access to drinking water is nationally, at all times. We should be outraged all the time. And so in what ways does education around what our water contains play a role in what your organization does? And how does that galvanize legislation and measures that you all take to ensure that access?
Yeah. Oh, I'll go this from a couple of ways, but there's a famous saying in kind of organizing and advocacy: never let a good crisis go to waste. It's a very like pessimistic saying, but it's a very true one. These kind of water crises that we see across the country, Flint, Michigan, Newark, New Jersey had a similar lead pipes crisis. Hoosick Falls in New York had their PFAS crisis. All of this galvanizes public attention. It galvanizes media attention, and it, oftentimes has a sense that there's been some failing and failure from decision makers who didn't address the problem when they should have. Those kind of crises, honestly, are amazing for political action. The reason that Michigan and New Jersey are so good on the lead pipes issue from a statewide policy perspective is because they had those water crises. And so something we try and do in Environmental Advocates New York is to think about how can we get the statewide policy action we need before a water crisis like this happens? How can we convince decision makers to protect public health before people get sick? And I think a lot of that gets to that kind of proactive education and organizing of communities on the ground. Something that I'm really quite excited for over the next couple of years on the lead pipes issue is that EPA is currently requiring every single water utility in the country to develop lead service line inventories. For every single service line in their system, they have to identify whether it's lead, whether it's not lead, or whether they don't know. Those inventories are going to be publicly accessible. People with a lead pipe or an unknown pipe are going to get a letter in the mail every single year that situation exists in their home. And I think that's going to galvanize a lot of interest and resulting pressure to do more to address the lead pipes issue. So yeah, that education component, absolutely critical.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for Mr. Hayes. Rob, thank you for taking time out of your schedule to join us and share your insights. Many of us can only aspire to serve the human and natural environments in the incredible fashion that you have. Let's give Rob a hand.
Thank you, Dan. Great to be here.
Thank you. Next, we have Paul Burns, Executive Director of the Vermont Public Interest Research Group, or VPIRG, a position he's held since 2001. He previously worked for 15 years as an attorney advocate and organizer for public interest research groups in New York and Massachusetts. Founded in 1972, VPIRG is the largest nonprofit consumer and environmental advocacy organization in the state. Without limitation, VPIRG's many accomplishments under Paul's leadership include establishing Efficiency Vermont, the first of its kind energy efficiency utility in 1999, banning fracking in 2012, and retiring Vermont Yankee in 2014 after years of organizing, implementing new regulations on toxics, including the precedent-setting requirements that GMO foods be labeled, and passing the Global Warming Solutions Act in 2020. Please welcome Paul Burns.
Thanks, Daniel. It's awfully nice to be with you.
Thank you, Paul. Was there anything that I missed about you or VPIRG before we get started?
I can't imagine you did.
Excellent. Well, could you begin then by giving us your crash course in crafting an environmental campaign? What's the process like and what areas require the most attention?
Sure. Well, and you've heard some of this already from my good friend Rebecca, and I appreciate the excellent work of environmental advocates in New York, who we sometimes partner with, or at least in shared campaign mode with. Let me try to hit some of the highlights in terms of how we approach a campaign. And the first thing that you need to do, of course, is to define your goal. What is it that you're trying to achieve? What would determine a win in this case? That's particularly important because you'd be surprised at how far down the path of a campaign some folks get before they really decide what it is that they're trying to achieve exactly. And it's particularly important when you have a coalition of organizations that you're working together with, that you can agree on that goal. So you have your path, you have your eyes on the prize, and you should always keep reminding yourself and others of what it is that you're trying to achieve. Once you determine your goal, you figure out who has the capacity, the power to grant you that success. Who are the decision makers that you're going to need to influence in order to win? In our case, we work primarily on state legislation or state policy. So we're looking at passing a law or getting an agency to enforce a law. But in other places, it might be a public referendum that you're trying to win on election day to get people to pass a policy that you're interested in. Whatever it is, decide who the decision makers are, figure that out, and then you come up with a strategy about how you will influence those decision makers. When you're talking about passing a law in the state legislature, for instance, you might be thinking about an insider strategy. If it's a campaign that you think can be won simply on its merits, a quiet campaign in the building with you and other experts sharing your knowledge, and not a lot of opposition, sometimes there are campaigns like that. Those aren't the big environmental campaigns with a lot of opposition and a lot of pushback. But if you have a campaign like that, you can think about an insider strategy, and you don't need to worry about mobilizing large numbers of people. Most often in our case, we're trying to take on big, powerful, wealthy special interests. And that means we will need a campaign which has more outsider elements, that is mass mobilization of some sort. And so you need to engage with large numbers of people so that those decision makers know at the end of the day, not just that you're right on the merits, but that doing what you're asking them to do will be more likely to get them reelected. That is to say, more people support doing the right thing than oppose it. And it's on us to demonstrate that we have the public support behind us, not just that we are right on the issues. And when you get the strategy down, you ultimately then start to figure out tactically, how will you pursue that campaign? And in the tactics, you have a number of different elements, from research. That includes research on the policy, so you do your homework, you know what you're talking about, and also public opinion research. If you've got the capacity, the money to conduct a poll or a focus group, you can find out more about what the public thinks on your issue and know how best to influence them. You're going to be writing materials, you're going to be doing coalition work, you're going to be doing grassroots organizing, media and advocacy, lobbying. Those are all elements of a good campaign plan. I could talk for an hour on each of them. I'm not going to do that, but just rest assured, if we are going to be taking on people, individuals, entities, most often corporations, who are more powerful, more wealthy, with more lobbyists in the building, in the State House than you have. And so you need to be smart about how you will use your limited resources to come up with enough power to overcome their opposition and to win with those decision makers who have the power to give you what they want.
Incredible. Thank you very much, Paul. I hope everyone's taking notes. There will be a quiz later. You have helped pass some really astounding laws here in Vermont, such as the labeling of GMO foods and the fracking ban. Did you follow a similar process to your crash course when you were confronting these issues?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I won't carry you through each of the elements there, but let me just describe to you how we started on those campaigns, because this is something that many of you could, I think, relate to. On fracking, I was one day at a meeting of state officials and environmental officials and environmental organizations and activists, and almost in an offhanded way, one of the state officials said, you know, Vermont's never going to be a place with big fracking. We don't have those kind of fossil fuel resources here, as far as we know. But there was fracking taking place, obviously, in the southern tier of New York and in Quebec, north of us. And so this official said, you know, even if we wanted to, we don't have the capacity under state law right now to just stop that practice or a request for permits to do fracking here. I left that meeting and I returned back to the office. I said to folks, why don't we ban fracking in Vermont? Because we haven't banned it now. Nobody has banned it so far, but it would be good for this state and it would be good for the nation to have a state move forward and ban fracking. We ultimately did do that. Again, it took a major effort. Many states were trying to do it, but we had the capacity to do it here, in part because there wasn't fracking taking place here. And so we didn't have those resources tied up with it. And by the time the American Petroleum Institute, which represents the fossil fuel industry, by the time they realized what was happening, they decided to fly in lobbyists from DC who looked rather out of place in our state house. And then they were taking out full page ads in the newspapers, which just didn't sit well with our decision makers in the state house. And they ultimately lost that. The day after we passed the bill, I was invited to New York State, the New York State Capitol, to participate in a press conference with activists there who were trying to pass a ban on fracking in New York. There were hundreds of people there on they call the $1 million staircase inside the Capitol in New York. I'm led through this crowd. They're parting it, so I get up there. Ultimately, get to an opening where there are full of TV cameras, and they say, "Okay, go ahead and speak." And I look to my left. And there's Mark Ruffalo, who some of you know is an actor, activist, alter ego of the Hulk. And I said, "Oh," I didn't realize he was going to be there. And it was a fun moment to celebrate the passage of fundamentally important legislation like banning fracking in Vermont. And ultimately, I think what we did there was helpful in New York State, which later, not too much longer, they ended up passing a ban on fracking there, where fracking was a big deal, was going to be a big deal in the southern tier of New York. Listen, on GMOs, it's kind of a similar thing. I was a new dad. I was walking my 3-month-old son in a stroller when an old friend called and said, "Hey, I'm working with an organization that has some money to spread to a few states where we think there might be some capacity for those states to run a campaign to require genetically engineered foods to be labeled. I know VPIRG has done similar work like this in the past. Would you be interested?" My kid's in the stroller, he's crying. And I said, "Look, you got $20,000? Absolutely. Send it my way. We will hire a recent VLS grad," and we did, Falco Schilling, to run this campaign for us. He's now the top policy person at Vermont ACLU, but he worked with us for years and helped to pass this legislation in Vermont. And it took a huge effort. And I think we'll talk later about how federal government can sometimes preempt good things in the states, like labeling GMOs. But we were able to pass it here when big states like California and Washington and others had tried to put this issue on the ballot in a ballot campaign. I think what made Vermont different is that we could run this campaign through the legislature and make our arguments to key legislators. And then ultimately we went door to door in the state, gathered 32,000 signatures from Vermonters who said they think their food should be labeled if it's been genetically engineered. We got so many petitions and postcards signed. We generated phone calls to legislators as they were taking this issue up. One legislator said on the floor, "I don't agree with VPIRG on anything, but on this, I have to vote the way they want because I've just heard from 150 of my constituents, and I never hear from that many constituents on anything, and therefore I'm going to vote to label GMOs." And it really came down to an issue of democracy more than it did the merits of the issue.
That's quite fascinating. Thank you. From my experience in the legislature, it's quite easy to identify out-of-state attorneys because they don't wear the Vermont attorney uniform, flannel, and a puppy vest. So when you were dealing with these issues, and you touched on this a little bit, what were some of the main sources of opposition in the legislature, the private sector, and from the public, and how did you coalesce?
Well, again, I think Rebecca mentioned this earlier, that in Vermont, we have opposition from industry groups. They have their lobbyists, they have their associations, et cetera, and they are a powerful force there. We have a governor currently who doesn't have a strong interest in environmental protection or public health. And I don't mean to say he is actively, opposing measures to protect public health. That's not his primary interest. He's going to side with the business lobbyists most often. And so we have to think about what we can bring to the table here. And so we have expertise, we have organizers, we have supporters, we have coalition partners, we have contacts with the media. We know how to get messages out that help to influence people. And we have to use all of that, again, to be smart, because it's hard to compete with the paid lobbyists. I mean, Rebecca is a contract lobbyist, mostly representing folks who are doing good things. You know, we contract with her firm to work on climate, for instance, and to work on democracy issues like ranked choice voting. But there are a lot of counterparts for other organizations, other lobbying outfits that will simply go to the highest corporate bidder, and they most often outnumber us substantially in a hearing room. I took a photo a few years ago of our one lone lobbyist 2 years out of undergrad who was working on a toxics issue. And I happened to be in the room at that time. The rooms were very crowded. This was pre-COVID. And I took a photo of him surrounded by 5 lobbyists on one side, 6 on the other, all representing a different corporate interest. And we did a fun little photo with writing on it to indicate what industry group, what corporation each of those lobbyists represented, and then the 1 VPIRG lobbyist there. I think that was helpful to us in the end, but it is hard to know that you're going to be outnumbered in that way when you're working in the State House.
Thank you. I'd like to touch on one of the other topics that you previously mentioned, which was when you're experiencing issues of preemption, how do you go about resolving those issues? What does the back and forth of the battle look like?
Well, it's difficult. So on that issue of genetically engineered foods, for instance, you know, we worked for more than 3 years to pass legislation in Vermont, which required foods that have been genetically engineered to carry a label. And when we passed it, we knew that we were likely to be sued. As a matter of fact, we developed what we called the Food Fight Fund in Vermont, which was a fund that private individuals and other interested parties could contribute to help the state defend against litigation from giant food manufacturers. When Neil Young was on tour, he and his band played a concert in Vermont. And after that concert, he held a press conference with the governor and certain folks who were working on this campaign. And he ended up writing a check then and there for $100,000 to the Food Fight Fund. It was cute and it was interesting. I didn't love the idea as a precedent that every time we pass a law that might result in litigation by industry, that we, the advocates, would have to come up with a fund. So far, we've never done it since, fortunately. But in this case, it was important because everybody knew that we were going to be sued. Ultimately, litigation did start, which could have preempted us. We won at the federal district court level. And then the manufacturers of these foods, giant, multi-billion-dollar, multinational companies, decided it would be easier for them to pass federal legislation through Congress that preempted the states from having laws like this on the books than it was to try to pursue that litigation all the way up to the Supreme Court. And that's what they did. They passed a law in Congress. And I sat in my basement, ultimately, watching C-SPAN in the final votes in Congress as they passed this law to preempt little Vermont. Vermont was the only state that had passed this legislation. And they passed federal legislation that said, no state can do this. We're going to do it at the federal level in a very weak and not very productive way. And I was thinking back to that day when I'm walking my kid in the stroller, and a campaign ultimately led to federal legislation being passed in front of my eyes to preempt us. Look, we're limited in that sense, Daniel, as you know. Once the federal government says the state cannot do it, we've run out of luck on that front. So we look to other ways. We look to make the federal laws as strong as it can be. But that was an unfortunate result of our leadership here in Vermont, that it came to a result in federal legislation that ultimately preempted us and others from doing what I think was the right thing for consumers.
That's quite fascinating. So to make sure that I understand, you passed the law on GMOs here knowing that you would get sued by the federal government in a tactic in order to pressure them to pass better legislation?
Well, we didn't want them to pass. We wanted them to pass good federal legislation, but that wasn't going to happen with that Congress. And unfortunately, Obama signed the legislation as well that was weak and that ultimately preempted the states. we felt that passing it here would also be a roadmap for other states. And frankly, though some food manufacturers said, we're not going to sell food into Vermont if you make us label it with a GMO label, that didn't really happen. You know, we were on the books for a period of a couple of months. Some manufacturers started already changing their products. I think if you were to go and buy a package of peanut M&Ms today, you might see the label on it even today that says does not contain genetically modified organisms. And that's one of the things that caused manufacturers to start using those labels, both certainly if they contain GMOs and some to proudly tout the fact that they did not contain it. So we did get sued. We won initially, and then I think the industry feared that they may not win in the courts, and they thought it would be easier to pass federal legislation. I mean, that tells you what kind of power they have, that they just suddenly decide, I think we better pass a federal law that preempts Vermont and these other states from doing it. Now, look, that has not happened in every case, and we certainly fight hard with allies in all of the states to ensure that when environmental laws are passed, they set a floor and not a ceiling, that you know, that it is possible for states to go further to protect public health and the environment than what the basic federal law requires. And sometimes we have that opportunity and we take full advantage of it here and in other places.
That's really quite impressive. Thank you. When crafting a campaign, what are some of the most common errors that environmentalists make, and what advice would you have on how to avoid them?
I think one of the problems, let me tell you what happens, I think, on environmental issues. Rebecca mentioned again that it is tough to pass some of these environmental laws, some of the tougher public interest laws that we work on. And VPIRG works on a broad range of issues, from consumer protection to democracy issues to healthcare, toxics, climate, etc. These are some of the toughest issues. And we have found over the years that sometimes politicians fear the backlash that they will get from passing bold climate or environmental legislation more than they fear what will happen to them politically if they fail to pass that legislation. So another way of thinking about it is that the environmental community, folks who are interested and concerned about the environment and climate, are not yet flexing their political muscles in the way that they need to in order to elect people to office who will do the right thing when it comes to the environment, public health, and climate. And we've got to get better. We've got to get stronger. We've got to get smarter at that. In Vermont, we sometimes say, look, the decision about what kind of environmental legislation can be passed isn't necessarily made in January or March or May when the legislative session ends. It's made in November when people go to the polls and vote. And that sets the parameters within which all the other decisions of the legislative session will be made. Now, this year, we and others went out and helped to elect we created a political arm a few years ago because we were so concerned that the legislature here was failing to do what they needed to address climate change and other issues. And so we said, we need to get more active in politics, and we need to help identify candidates who will be champions, and we will help to put them into office. And so this year, the folks who generally lean in favor of environmental protection have the largest majority they've ever had in the House of Representatives. And they have 23 of the 30 members of the state Senate. That doesn't guarantee us success on things. And again, you heard earlier that we've got a Republican governor who is likely to veto many of the things that we try to get passed through the legislature. So we need to get 20 of 30 in the Senate, and we need to get at least 100 of 150 in the House. And that is never an easy thing to do, but we have a greater capacity to hit those numbers because we've worked harder to elect people who will, I think, do the right thing when it comes down to that close and important vote.
Thank you, Paul. When you need a champion, I'm here for you. I know that we have at least one question from the audience.
Hi. So I was just curious about what do you happen to know what the justification was that the federal government used to shoot down your GMO labeling act that you wanted to pass? I know that it was probably under Commerce Clause jurisdiction, but I'm just curious as to what was the reasoning and the justification that they had to rejecting that.
Well, remember, there were a number of issues that they raised in the litigation. There's Commerce Clause, there's First Amendment, we were forcing them to speak by labeling their product when they didn't want to be forced to speak in that way. And there were other issues, which is always kind of funny to me, but there were a number of things. Again, we won at least at the initial level. Would we have won all the way up? Who knows? We never had the chance because they then went to Congress, and they don't need to make those same arguments in Congress. They're not making a legal argument in Congress. They're saying, this is going to cost us money. We gave you a campaign contribution. We would like you to stop those states from doing this stuff. Now, I'm not saying every conversation took place exactly that way, but it was at least a subtext. These were entities, organizations that don't just pay lobbyists a lot to work in the halls of Congress. They do make lots of campaign contributions to candidates, and that it's not a bag of money that guarantees them a vote. But what it does do is it usually means that their calls will be returned, that they will have meetings, and that in those meetings, they have the opportunity to influence the decision maker in ways that we or others that represent consumers in this kind of situation don't often have. And again, you look at Congress now, you see where they lean, and unfortunately, it can be identified largely by who controls the political party, as to what they're going to do on an issue like this. And businesses would say, we can't be trying to meet the standards of 50 different states when they come up with a labeling requirement. And that's true. I mean, that'd be a headache. That's what they call that is a patchwork quilt of environmental regulations. And then they go to Congress to say, please pass something that preempts the states from having these different standards. I think there are times where that's a legitimate argument because it is hard for them, as if you're a national manufacturer of a product, to try to meet different standards in multiple different states. I think that's true. I just think in this case, Congress wasn't really trying to pass a standard that would give the public good, clear information about GMOs. What they were trying to do, and what they did do, was prevented Vermont and other states from having any kind of effective law to tell people that the food that they may be buying and consuming had been genetically engineered. So it was a gift to industry more than anything else. But there are times where we work intentionally in different states to pass laws that may differ a little bit one from another in order to provoke the federal government to act. And this may have been what Daniel was talking about earlier. On toxics, for instance, we have done that very intentionally, getting different states to pass laws that require disclosure or ban certain chemicals in certain products. And then those businesses, if we are enough of a pain in the ass to those businesses who say, I can't take it anymore, I can't do another state's individual regulation, they go to Congress. And then if we have done it in enough states, Congress may say, hey, yeah, we're not just going to prevent the states from acting in this area. We're going to have to establish a floor, and then we have to fight like heck to make sure that that floor is meaningful and is as strong as it possibly can be. And as I said earlier, we still do try to allow states to go further, particularly in areas where we're talking about protecting public health. And sometimes we win that argument in Congress.
I think we might have time for one more quick question.
Thanks. Hi, Paul. Thanks for making an appearance.
Yeah.
Hey, so I think it might be fair to say that a lot of times in Vermont, people want the same outcome, like ultimately have the same goal of living in a clean environment, wanting to move to clean energy, but there's like so many different opinions on the best method to do that. How do you convince the decision makers that your method to getting to that goal is the best one, and the public that you're campaigning to as well?
Well, it's a great question, and there is no easy single answer to that, as you might imagine, but we have to do our homework first. We have to be experts ourselves, or as is often the case for us, we're looking to others who have expertise that exceeds our own. You know, we aren't wearing white lab coats here when we're trying to pass legislation dealing with toxics or public health. We depend on scientists, experts, doctors, and others who have spent years of their lives trying to figure this stuff out. And we go to them and try to develop what we think are innovative solutions that could work for Vermont. And sometimes it is important to note that Vermont doesn't have the capacity to pass a law that requires a great deal of oversight and engagement from a regulatory body, because we have an agency here that might have 2 or 3 people in an environmental division, where California might have 200 or 300 people. And so you look to sometimes larger states to, if it says we're going to study this and figure out what the exact level of a contaminant might be that would be allowed here. You know, we have limited capacity to do that in Vermont. And so we rely on others to come up with the standard. And we might write the law that says, let's follow California's lead, or let's follow whatever state has the most protective standard, or it might be the European Union, for instance. But you have to be somewhat creative in that, in identifying what we think is the most effective solution here that we can get past. And I would say too, whether if we're looking at chemicals, for instance, if we think it's a dangerous chemical, our inclination is to try to ban its use. So then you're protecting workers, you're protecting the consumers who may use that product, you're protecting people downstream when that product is ultimately disposed of, even in a landfill. Ultimately, landfills leak, you know, and so you want to stop the use of those chemicals as much as possible. But if you don't have enough scientific backing and evidence that would justify a ban, you may have to go for labeling so that at least you're giving consumers information before they purchase that product and bring it into their home and hand it to their kid to, you know, to stick in their mouth. At least they have information about the potential dangers of that product. And that's why for GMOs, for instance, we never said people are going to die from eating GMOs, but we did think people had a right to know about it. With certain toxic chemicals, we're going for the ban because we think that we have the justification and that is the right thing to do. And so it is always trying to figure out, do you have the evidence? Do you have the research to back up the most protective solution that you may be able to get to move forward?
Thank you, Paul. I wish we could talk with you all evening. You're nothing but a gold mine of information. And thank you for joining us. And we're lucky to have your valuable insights and expertise. I feel confident that your testimony tonight will inspire many exciting and monumental campaigns here to serve the public. Let's give Paul a round of applause.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. It is now 7:30, and joining us, we have Representative Christine Palm, a member of the Connecticut House of Representatives, serving her 3rd term on the House Environment Committee. Before being elected, she was a women's policy analyst for the General Assembly's Commission on Women, Children, and Seniors, and advocated for policies enhancing these populations' safety and economic security. She has also served as the communications director of the Permanent Commission on the Status of Women and the media director for the Office of the State Treasurer. Representative Palm has worked in both the executive and legislative branches of government and understands the responsibilities and opportunities of serving in the General Assembly. She's also the owner of Sexual Harassment Prevention, LLC, which works to keep workplaces free from the devastating effects of sexual harassment. Please welcome Representative Christine Palm. How are you this evening, Christine?
Hey, everybody. I'm very happy to be with you. Thank you for sticking it out. Those of you who are still here, I'm sorry I can't see all your faces, but it's wonderful to have young people, students, potential lawyers caring about the environment. And Daniel, I'm grateful that you invited me.
We're overjoyed and privileged to have you here. There's many people that are hiding in the back. So I'd like to begin by, well, first, did I miss anything in your introduction?
No, that was great. Thanks.
Excellent. What role can states play for environmental law that the federal government is neglecting?
So, you know, as you all know, the supremacy clause is an interesting thing. And I think both parties use it to their advantage, especially in reproductive rights here in Connecticut. We are nationally a beacon of protecting women's rights, and I know that's not what we're here to discuss tonight. But I think, simply put, states' rights is a thing that both parties work to their advantage when they want to. And I was listening with interest to some of the other speakers. Paul Burns mentioned about PFAS, which we were able to ban last year in firefighting foam, and next year we're going to ban it from commercial packages. Until the federal government does more widespread and far-reaching legislation on behalf of the environment, it is going to be up to states to do it. And as he said, you can have a more stringent than federal law. You just can't undermine federal law. So we can go farther on things like banning PFAS than the feds are doing. What we can't do is go under that bar. I think he put it well when he said it sets a floor, but not a ceiling.
Thank you. And I'll ask you a similar question that I asked Mr. Burns, which was, do you have experience navigating the issue of preemption with your legislature?
It comes up all the time. And guys, I don't know what kind of a makeup politically this is. And so I'm going to just speak freely and hope I don't offend anybody. In Connecticut, the Democrats, of which I am one, have a supermajority in both the House and the Senate. Obviously, there are some exceptions. There are some environmentally conscious Republicans. There are some Democrats who aren't great, but most of us fall in those two camps for a reason. And so a lot of what we spend our time doing, which the other speakers alluded to, but from the perspective of lobbyists or advocates, is convincing the other side of the aisle to do the right thing. And where this gets tricky is that if you watch the national arguments about the filibuster, you realize that the closer you get to the end of session, whether it's federal or state, the more power the minority party has. A minority simply means whoever is not in the majority, right? So in Connecticut, the minority party is Republicans. Because they can filibuster and drag out the discussion and obfuscate, a lot of really good bills die because we literally run out of time legally. You have to end, at least in Connecticut, it's called sine die, without day. You stop at the stroke of midnight on a certain day. So the closer we get to sine die, which is June 7th this year, the more they can fart around and slow things down. Consequently, the filibuster is really to blame for preventing states from being more powerful than the federal government because of party and partisan shenanigans.
Interesting. And just to clarify, the Connecticut legislature also has a filibuster.
Well, we don't call it that, but they don't. What we say is whether or not we call the question. Call the question means, okay, we're going to stop the discussion. We're going to vote now. We're going to take a vote. Our Speaker of the House doesn't believe in doing that. He is a Democrat. He has a very deep respect for parliamentary procedures. Ironically, even though he's half my age, I think it's a very old-fashioned notion. And it's about, respecting the process of debate, which is great, hoping for bipartisanship, which is great, respecting your colleagues, which is great, but the world is on fire. And we cannot waste time being nice anymore. So if I had my way, I would call the question, I would put things to a vote. I would say, stop with your discussions about how climate change is a hoax. I'm tired of hearing it. Vote now. But we don't do that. So we end up having to do an awful lot of negotiation, which slows the process down.
I see. One of your accomplishments that we mentioned at the beginning of this evening was that you helped pass the Connecticut Clean Air Act. What was the process like for passing that statute, and what were some of the political difficulties or barriers you encountered, and how did you navigate them to pass the statute?
Well, so it's what the previous speakers have all mentioned from their end of the equation. Business interests have been successfully pitted as being inherently oppositional to environmental interests, and I reject that. I don't believe that. I believe environmentalism is good for business. It is good for attracting young people. It's good for reducing asthma rates, and therefore we don't have to spend as much on healthcare costs, et cetera, et cetera. But the powers that be have pitted this false narrative that to be pro-environment is to be anti-business, and I just don't believe that's true. But what ends up happening is whether it's extended producer responsibility for recycling, whether it's getting rid of PFAS. I mean, there were a whole bunch of bills that have come up, waste management. There's currently a bill in Connecticut is actually governor's bill, an agency bill, to really overhaul how we dispose of solid waste. We're shipping it all out of state because our last plant is closing down. And what we keep hearing over and over and over again is it's too expensive, it's too bad for business. So the Clean Air Act, to get back to your question, simply says that the state of Connecticut must electrify its fleet of state cars and buses by, I think, 2030. And we want to have zero carbon sources for energy by 2040. We're not on target to meet that. So I introduced a bill this year to hold state agencies accountable with metrics and data to show how and whether they are moving toward those goals. But little interesting note, the Clean Air Act, which I named, was actually going to be called an act concerning the reduction of emissions in particulate, blah-bity, blah-bity, blah-bity. And I said, guys, if you can't have a name like that makes it easy for people to vote against because it's too complicated and boring. Call it the Clean Air Act and make people say, I'm opposed to clean air. I'm going to vote no because I don't want clean air. And when I was your guys' age in the 70s, we had the first Earth Day, and the federal government passed the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the EPA. I mean, remarkable. It was the birth of the environment movement in the 70s. And Republicans were on board as well as Democrats. But you think about those titles, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, there's a lot of persuasive power in naming a thing properly and not being too wonky about it. So the Clean Air Act, we got it through and we made it impossible for people to say no, although some did.
That's quite ingenious. I really like that. I'm sure we'll be taking that with us. And that kind of feeds into our next question, which is, what does collaboration look like between your committee or the legislature and state agencies?
Well, I mean, you all know about the co-equal branches of government, civics 101. So the executive branch carries out the laws that the legislative branch makes, right? And then the judicial branch upholds those laws. So it's a little weird dance. The state agencies, and in Connecticut, it's the Department of Environment and Energy and Environmental Protection. They merged, a couple years ago, two agencies, which I think are inherently at odds, environment and energy. But in Connecticut, we blended them. I think they should be broken apart. And they come up with bills and ideas, many of which are great. And then they also do things that we don't think are so great. For example, we are about to vote tomorrow on a bill that would allow, in its earlier iteration, it would allow hunting of bears in Connecticut. I believe Connecticut is the only state on the eastern seaboard that currently does not allow bear hunting. And we had to do a lot of negotiation with our Republican ranking members and with the agency, DEEP, which controls state parks and wildlife, to try to mitigate the interactions with bears, because Connecticut is tiny, as you guys know, compared to Vermont, and bears are opening car doors, they're breaking into people's houses. It sounds funny, they're swimming in swimming pools. It's actually kind of crazy and not funny. So we're trying to mitigate those human encounters in a way that doesn't just result in wholesale slaughter of them. But my point is that the state agency is asking us for permission to do a bear hunting, and we're saying no. We're going to vote tomorrow and say no. You got to figure out a different way to do it. So they're our partner, but they're also our antagonist. And it's a little bit like a dysfunctional family. You know, we love them, but they get on our last nerve.
Thank you. On the flip side, trying to use them for something other than being annoyed, are there ways that the Connecticut agencies have been able to improve environmental regulation and conservation where the state legislature has not been able to?
Oh, that's a great question, Daniel. I must say, I should have said at the outset, our governor at the moment, Ned Lamont, is a really good environmental governor. You know, he does care. He was behind TCI, which was the Transportation Climate Initiative, which was an interstate compact. It didn't end up flying. He was also in favor of tolls, which we used to have here in Connecticut. But the special interests are powerful, and there's really no delicate way to put this. It often comes down to who squawks the loudest. And we finally, after 20 years, last year, revamped our bottle bill. And it took 20 years to make the return deposit go from 5 cents to 10 cents, because the industry was so powerful and didn't want us to do it. So we have a great governor when it comes to environmental stuff, and our agencies, you know, genuinely want to do the right thing. I do believe that, and they are our partners. But there is inherently, you know, we as the lawmaking body have to oversee what they do and sometimes rein them in. And sometimes we give them permission, and sometimes we don't. But we always talk to them. I mean, it's really important to have a good relationship with your state agencies and work together on stuff. So here's a really good example. A very young 16-year-old environmentalist came to me with an idea to codify the labeling of plastics. Right now, plastic recycling is a mess. Nobody knows what's recyclable and what isn't. And this young guy had a great idea. I put in a bill, it was moving along, but to your earlier question, Daniel, about federal versus state, there is no federal coding system that makes any sense. If you guys know, you know, Chasing Arrow, Solid Arrow, PETE5, it's just a hot mess. So I wanted to do it in Connecticut. That would be a state law. But it turned out to be too unwieldy, and it would have really punished the business interests, which we didn't want to do. And it would have meant that your local grocery store couldn't carry a product that was produced nationally if it didn't have this coding. So as a compromise, they asked me and this young man to sit on an advisory board, a workshop group, to help devise a coding system for a future law. So that was a really good working compromise that we arrived at, and I withdrew my bill.
Thank you. And I wanted to touch on one more piece from what you mentioned, and that is that whoever squawks the loudest generally has the most power. How do we squawk louder? Is it just a matter of having more money or more members of the legislature? Or is there more to it than that?
Well, at least speaking for myself and in Connecticut, it's not about money. I forget who mentioned it, but voting for your representatives and your state senators based on their environmental record. I mean, I know you guys have advocates. I saw Vermont PIRG was on there. We have a thing called the League of Conservation Voters. They rank people. I'm honored to be called environmental champion. I ought to be. I'm the vice chair of the damn committee. If I weren't, I would have no business having that title. And they actually look at voting records and then they rate us. So people need to go to those candidates and say, where do you stand on recycling, food scrap diversion, climate teaching? I was able to get I ran on a promise to get the teaching of climate change mandatory in the school systems, and Connecticut became the second state to do that. New Jersey beat us to it using my language, but that's okay. We were the second. And wait, I've lost the question. Sorry, where was I going?
Squawk louder.
Oh, squawk louder. Thank you. So some young environmentalists with the Sunrise Institute helped me get elected. And what you need to do is find out who lives in the district of these legislators and call them. It takes 7 contacts. This is nationally known, between 5 and 7 hits, if you will, personal, to a legislator before we go, oh, this is the thing people really care about. It doesn't take 200 phone calls. What we don't want, and I beg you guys, please don't do this. These slacktivist networks, onevoice.com, myamerica.com, communityactivism.com, they were well-meaning, some of them Russian bots, and they will say, we'll make it easy for you to email your legislators. And then what happens is you say, sure, put my name on the thing. We get bombarded, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of letters a day, sometimes, from people outside our district, the same exact letter. It feels like harassment. It doesn't make me say, gee, people care. What does make me say people care is somebody who actually stops me on the street or in the grocery store and talks to me, comes up to the Capitol and testifies on a bill, gets my phone number and calls me, texts me, shows up at an event that I'm speaking at. And if you get all your friends who live in districts of non-compliant or unfriendly legislators, and you say, I am a voter in your district, I won't vote for you again unless you do this. Or I will challenge you, even better. I hope you guys run for office. Challenge people and run against them. And that's what squawks the loudest, is we're going to outvote you if you don't do a better job for the environment. And if those legislators are not accessible to you, if they don't return your phone call, if they don't help you, right now on this call is a young intern named Brett Hurley. He's my wonderful intern. He goes to UConn. He's spending his days helping me answer phone calls and emails from constituents who are concerned about different bills, including environment bills. We're answering every one of them. That's how you beat these guys, because you say we're going to outvote you. So that's the most important squawk, is make sure that you're in that district, that it's a real email. Dear Representative Palm, I live on Jones Avenue. You know, I heard you 3 weeks ago at such and such. You're an idiot. That gets my attention. Or thank you, you're not an idiot. Thank you for your vote. That's a person that I really want to engage with, not a snowstorm of email that isn't even, that the person didn't even take the time or the courtesy to actually compose.
I'm glad that we have you here tonight. You were the right pick. I have one more question for you, and then I believe we have a question or two from the folks over at PACE University. You mentioned earlier that you don't think that interests in business and the environment are necessarily opposed. Have you found any solutions that serve both the private sector and the environment?
I guess this sounds like a negative way to put it, and I don't mean to. So this is good practice for me. But my feeling, what I say to industries is, you know, I've been at this all my life, right? And I'm almost 70 years old. How much longer do I have to wait before you guys do the right thing voluntarily? And if you don't want the heavy hand of government bonking you on the head with regulations, then step up and figure it out. So I get really frustrated when businesses say, oh, we need more time. Like, you've been in business since 1923 and you haven't figured out yet how not to use plastic. You're too stupid to even be in business. So I have like zero tolerance for that. What I love is when businesses come forward and say, hey, we believe in the environment, or our customers want cardboard takeout. They don't want plastic takeout. Or how can we help? And one of, this is just a quick example because it springs to mind. I mentioned the bottle bill. One of the problems with the bottle bill was those little things that in Connecticut we call nips. I don't know what you guys call them, but the little swigs
Little
of
shooter
food.
bottles?
Yeah. They're a big part of litter. People drink them and toss them. Well, the reverse vending machines can't take those. There's nothing you can do with them. And people don't bring them back to the liquor store because there's no deposit. So what industry did as a compromise was the Environment Committee said, nips are a big problem with litter and they're not being recycled. So what the industry did as a concession was agreed to pay the town in which the nip was sold 5 cents for every nip. And then that money could be used to hire a recycling coordinator, put their own bottle redemption box in town hall where you chuck it in, however the town wanted to handle it. And so the big cities like New Haven got like $200,000. I represent 4 little tiny towns. And we got like, $14,000 or $20,000, but it was enough to start a food scrap diversion program. So that was a cooperative thing that government and business did together for the good of all. And that's where the negotiation and the horse trading comes in. And yes, sometimes you have to threaten them and say, look, if you don't do it voluntarily, we're going to make you do it. I don't like it when it gets to that point. I would much rather they came to us and said, we want to be part of the solution. And they're starting to.
Great. I'm going to send it over to the folks at PACE University, who I believe have a question for you. Folks, go ahead and chime in right on the mic.
What's up, Pace?
Can you hear me?
I can.
Martin, I'm a one on PACE. Your statements about how powerful names are in making legislation. I know there's been a lot of talks about changing global warming to something else. How do you feel changing like the name of warming would help Republicans in office, like especially at the state level, like maybe rethink their opinions about climate change in general?
The question was a little garbled. I think your question was, what about rebranding climate change to something else? Was that the question?
Yes.
Yeah, personally, I refer to it as climate chaos because global warming sounds friendly. And, those of us who live half of the year freezing up here, we're always happy to have it get warm and sunny. I think climate chaos is what we're experiencing, the warming that we know from the ocean evaporating and then coming into these torrential floods and tornadoes and hurricanes and stuff. So I think when you call it that, it's a little bit more convincing. So I've started to urge people to call it that instead of climate change or, and also I have a bill that's running tomorrow to create a climate emergency, which the state of Hawaii has done and several cities have done. I'm hoping Connecticut will become the second state to declare a national climate emergency. Because it's not just a symbolic designation, it opens up federal funds. If you have a like FEMA emergency, you can actually get money from the feds and do a lot of cool stuff with it. So good question. I think that's a term that we need to start using more regularly.
Thank you.
Excellent. Do we have any other questions from the folks at PACE or anyone online? If not, we have one here in our audience.
Yes, we do have one more question on PACE.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Can you hear me a little bit better?
Yep.
All right. I have some fun out here at my name is Tulon Pham, and my question to you is along the same lines. When I think of green laws, policies, statutes, I think of the Green New Deal, and I don't have a clear vision of what that means, and I can't imagine that I'm alone in that. If you could rename the Green New Deal, what would you rename it and why?
Well, you know what I like about Green New Deal is that for the people who are in the power structure, who are of a certain age, the New Deal, the Roosevelt New Deal still resonates. And the Green New Deal actually has a good connotation for older farts like me, but maybe that's not what you're really asking. To me, economic incentive for young earners is about making sure that there are green jobs available. So I'll have to think about that. Nothing is occurring to me right now because unlike global warming, I actually like the term Green New Deal. because you guys deserve something other than the raw deal that my generation has given you. And I like the idea of a deal that works for people and is sincere and ethical and smart and will make everybody money and make everybody happy. That's how I see it. But just simple things like training young people in the teaching of climate change so that they're equipped with being part of a solution to a problem they had no hand in creating. I think we owe them that. And I hope that those of you who are thinking of going, well, I guess you're all in law school, right? This is a law school. So those of you who are thinking of going into environmental law, please be aware that you can make a very good living as what we call an LCO, legislative commissioner officer in Connecticut. These are lawyers who work for the legislature, helping us on policy. So when people like me, who are not lawyers, come up with this great idea and we submit a bill, we think it's a great idea, then the LCO lawyers say, actually, that's not legal. You can't do that. That's a crappy idea. Here's how to fix it. Here's how to strengthen it. So we have staff lawyers who are really helpful to the Environment Committee, just as a career note. But I think that's part of the Green New Deal, is that for all of us to survive, and especially you guys, we need to pivot away from the old model of economic gain and have it mean something more profound and equitable that is also economically smart.
Excellent. Thank you so very much, Representative Palm, for taking the time to join us this evening. And thank
see a
you
couple
for your
more questions.
unwavering.
Daniel, sorry, there's a couple more people with hands up. I'm happy to stay and answer them if you want.
I think we have time maybe for one more. We have one more speaker slated this evening.
Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot that. Okay, go ahead.
Let's do one more.
Okay.
I got my hand up. I don't know if people are looking at me or someone else.
Yeah, you're great. You're good. Sammy, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much for standing with the bears. We desperately need to stand with our animal brethren. Two, question would be for constituents who are stuck in areas where like voting polls are being moved out of their neighborhood. And like I'm been reading about this with neighborhoods in the South, like, you know, if it's neighborhoods where they're moving them out of like Black neighborhoods or colleges to try to make it harder for people to vote. For areas like that, with the kind of representatives that would be pushing for those kinds of changes, do you have any advice for how you would get through to those people? I know you said that you can say like, we'll outvote you if you don't, you know, go for this environmental emergency bill. But are there other ways of like pressuring those people in particular who might just not be willing to listen to people at all?
Yeah, that's a really important question. You know, gerrymandering and voter suppression is a huge problem. And there is this exciting intersection between the environment movement and the voting rights movement to prevent exactly what you're saying. And it stems from environmental justice, right? So we have to be united. When I say we, I mean white people of privilege. I represent a very wealthy district that's almost 100% white. We have to work with people who represent distressed communities, because air and water pollution don't know any economic or racial or political bounds, right? So it doesn't do any good if my district gets to vote for me because I'm an environmentalist, but then my wonderful colleague, Jerry Reyes, who's a wonderful legislator who represents the city of Waterbury, Connecticut. You know, he's my best ally up at the Capitol. We work together on environmental justice because I have to get my voters to care about that because of voter suppression in their district. So it's a real problem. It takes watchdogs. It takes, you know, learning to work with the media, making sure that people don't get discouraged. And it used to be, and this is really changing primarily because of people just like those of you in this room. It used to be that the environmental movement was perceived of as something for privileged people on their yachts. And while that's partly true, it's really about asthma prevention, economic, racism, putting polluting entities in overburdened and distressed communities. So I would say if you start with a mindset of environmental justice, what spreads out from that is access to the polls, and folks of color and poorer folks and folks in urban areas need to really know that this is their issue, absolutely, and own it and fight for it, because it will make their quality of life better, and people like me are there to help. I hope that doesn't sound cheesy.
Not at all. I think that was a perfect way to end. You're nothing short of an American hero. And there's hope on the horizon if the next generation of public servants are anything like yourself. Everybody, let's give a hand to Representative Palm.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. And lastly, this evening, we have Josh King at the Langdon Group, a dispute resolution organization. Josh King is an associate director providing the structure and opportunities for people to collaboratively solve problems on topics such as the National Environmental Policy Act, agency planning, natural resources, and environmental impact studies. He has mediated over 1,000 disputes and sits on the Leadership Council for the Association of Conflict Resolution and Public Policy. Josh holds a JD and Master of Dispute Resolution, barred in Utah since 2004. Josh is a collaborative professional with a keen understanding of the theory and practice of strategic communication, negotiation, mediation, facilitation, political dialogue, and dispute systems design. Please welcome Josh King.
All right, thanks, Daniel. It's hard to follow an American hero and do it the last half hour of 2.5 hours, but we'll give you the best we got here out west.
Not to worry, Josh, because you're my hero.
No, that's all I need.
Did I miss anything in your introduction that you wanted to add?
No, that's great. Appreciate that. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Now, you work to resolve a wide array of environmental disputes. What are the main barriers that you encounter?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, we work to resolve a wide variety of disputes. We are a consulting firm, third-party mediators, problem solvers. A lot of our work is with environmental dispute resolution, and we work upstream during policy making and planning primarily. And so environmental conflict resolution works when all affected stakeholders are motivated and willing to participate and collaborate. When the collaborating parties have decision-making authority, when sufficient time and resources are available to support the effort, and when the issue is ripe for discussion with all parties willing to negotiate key issues. Some of the barriers occur when any of those are lacking, when the parties come to the table or don't, I guess, or disinterested. Parties can have different motivations, right? But they do need to be somewhat aligned with the others in that they're willing to engage and motivated to engage. How they engage is just as important. Representative Palm mentioned, squawk louder. I would say to squawk smarter as well. And she did comment on how to do that, to engage on a personal level and show that you care. When parties come to the table and don't engage smartly, they're just there in with a competitive approach, that can be a barrier to problem solving and joint problem solving. So yeah, I'd say when any of those factors are lacking that makes an environmental dispute resolution process effective, that can be a barrier to achieving a resolution or problem solving.
Now, across this wide spectrum, all within the environmental field, do you find that the interests of your opposition are relatively uniform, or do they kind of vary case by case?
Yeah, they vary case by case. Yeah, it's not the same. I mean, they're uniform. You get certain NGOs or environmentalists that have the same MO, and that's just to disrupt. And that can be a barrier to effective problem solving and conflict resolution.
Excellent. When advising your clients on environmental matters, especially those of critical importance or severe impact, how do you determine acceptable concessions for the negotiating process?
Yeah, well, Paul mentioned earlier, first and foremost, you've got to help your client understand the issues, the interests, the parties. They understand their goals and desired outcomes, right? When they understand that, then you want to ask and consider, what are the trade-offs? Where else can we create value? What is the long-term play? How does the concession affect the relationships, trust, transparency? How will the concession affect our ability to achieve our desired outcome? Will it sabotage it? Will it hurt it? Is it a non-factor? And sometimes will it help? Sometimes a concession can help. I'll give you an example of that. We facilitated the environmental impact study process over a 5-year period. The client's main goal was to arrive at a preferred alternative and complete the environmental impact statement with by mitigating the threat of litigation. Previous highway had been built and it was bogged down in litigation for years. This was an extension of that highway, and so they wanted to mitigate against litigation, right? In this process, we identified the preferred alternative, and then at the 11th hour, an environmental stakeholder, an NGO group, proposed an alternative solution. And the client had to make a decision, do they want to concede on that, concede another year and the resources it would take to evaluate that alternative, or proceed with the process and move forward with the alternative they had. So thinking about what their goal was, their desired outcome, they decided to concede on that to mitigate future delay and expense and ensure buy-in from all parties, and that the project could move forward. And so sometimes that concession can help in obtaining your desired outcome and achieving your goals.
And could you maybe touch on that with the work you did relating to the water rights projects in Utah, Colorado, and Arizona?
Yeah.
Balancing concessions and the need for effective solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's very complicated. You have your upper Colorado River constituents, upper Colorado states, and the lower Colorado. And so you got to zoom back and think about the big picture in that, and that's really hard to do. And to get parties to do to come off positions and focus on interests, right? And so in a collaborative like that, what's helpful at the outset is developing a charter with the objectives of the charter, desired outcome of the charter, so decisions can be made holistically when thinking about the best interest of the watershed, as opposed to the myopic interests of one particular stakeholder, or one particular state or group.
Thank you. That's insightful. How do you modify your strategy when conflict arises from the same side, specifically within an environmental coalition? In other words, when there's a shared interest, but opposing views on how to best achieve.
Yeah, I think the best thing that you can do is engage, and don't be afraid to engage. The calmest part of a hurricane is right in the middle of the eye of the storm. You can't be afraid to go in there. You want to engage anybody that could potentially blow up the process or derail the process. I think Paul mentioned earlier, sometimes your biggest opponents become your best advocates. And that is, you're not going to arrive at that unless you bring the parties together and that through interests, concerns, hopes, fears, aspirations that all parties have.
Thanks. And what are some of the biggest mistakes that environmentalists make when negotiating or resolving disputes? And do you have any special advice on avoiding these mistakes?
Yeah, I think it goes back to something I just touched on, and that's participating with myopic motivations or unwillingness to collaborate. When they feel like they represent a certain interest and they play up their participation to their audience just to show that their audience has a voice and is being heard. So to them, it's like more like a show. They think they have one role or one part to play in that role, and generally lack imagination, foresight, intellectual insight. They don't understand the long game or the value of relationships. It's hard to build trust in that capacity or rapport or respect. And it can often turn into a self-fulfilling prophecy where they're not invited to participate because they're not coming at it collaboratively. It's more competitive. So I think those type of participants can be helped if they're more self-aware. They step back and look at their participation from the balcony and ask, how do I engage? How do I negotiate? How are we participating in this process? Or are we competitive all the time? And how is that being met from other participants in the process? What might happen if we're a little bit more cooperative or collaborative in this process? I've seen a few examples of this. One, you asked about the Colorado River. There was an area here in Utah that wanted to develop a water conservancy district so that they would have more control over the water and it wouldn't be sent downstream to Vegas and Los Angeles. In order to do that, they had to create a water conservancy district. There was one NGO that only participated to disrupt, right? And we knew that. The client knew that. We knew at the 11th hour this participant would come up from the south and disrupt. And so we actually use that as a strategy, know that, when at the 11th hour, who's going to be opposed to this? It's not going to be the locals. It'll be those that stand to benefit from not creating this district. And that participant did come up and did disrupt and was actually helpful to the collaborative and developing the district. So the example of how he thought he was engaging in a process that would represent the rights of his conservation interests, but actually hurt them and disrupted them.
Interesting. What is the biggest difference that you notice between resolving disputes, maybe in more of a corporate or nonprofit setting and government settings versus strictly private or just environmental issues?
Yes, that's a good question. So how do private environmental conflict resolution processes differ from, say, a corporate setting?
Yeah, corporate or nonprofit. Would you say that your process or the methods are relatively the same, just with different factors or different individuals? Or is there something that's unique to environmental mediation? And alternatively, are there things that are unique to corporate, nonprofit, or government disputes?
Yeah, I think environmental conflicts have the public aspect that needs to be incorporated into it. The public needs to have a voice because a lot of times the disputes are over public lands or public resources. So their space needs to be made for that public participation, whether it's through elected representatives or NGOs, public interest groups, or just broad outreach to the public and allow their engagement, and then a reflection back of what was heard from them and their ability to influence the process and engage in the process, and sometimes even engage in the decision-making of the outcome of that process.
Interesting. Thank you. One more question I have for you before I turn it over to some of our audience questions. For issues like NEPA or environmental impact studies, it always seems like a very kind of rigid process that has to be followed very carefully. Where does negotiating come in with issues like that? And what does it look like? And how could it influence the outcome?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one quote that I really like, and it's on my wall here, that I always have to remind myself, and when engaging in NEPA processes, is it's not that difficult to make something simple complex, but if you want to make something complex simple, it requires great effort. So in some, like, it's not difficult to make something simple very complex, right? But something like NEPA is very complex and it's very hard to make it simple. So a lot of times that is our goal, to make the engagement simple, right? To provide the space and the opportunity for stakeholders, for the public, for interested groups to come together to be heard and to see that their input is making a difference, right? And so that example I gave earlier on facilitating the environmental impact statement for the new highway, you know, we had to go from 43 alternatives down to 4 to 2, and that took a great deal of effort to get input and to arrive at that, so that, you know, it could be built with support from the various stakeholders, which we accomplished, but it took years. And I'll go back to what I said earlier. Sufficient time and resources are available for the effort. And so, yeah, this takes multiple facilitation with all stakeholders involved at a personal level. Like Representative Palm said, you know, and that's where I talk about squawk smarter and getting to the personal level, you know, with group meetings, individual one-on-one meetings, community meetings. Yeah, diversity of tools and strategies need to be employed to pull off a successful environmental study, and then to follow through with the construction of it.
So would you say that your role isn't necessarily resolving a dispute or a disagreement, but it's more so helping facilitate the process and helping all the interested parties engage with each other and communicate?
Yeah, that'd be a fair statement. Sometimes we come in and we have a more evaluative role to help facilitate something, but generally, yeah, it's broader and more facilitative. We're providing the environment or the platform to help others come to better informed decisions across a diversity of stakeholders.
Thank you. I appreciate you clarifying that. Do we have any questions from folks in the audience or those online? We have one.
Hi. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I did have a question. So many of the speakers that we've had tonight, including yourself, have mentioned that a strategy in proposing legislation and creating coalitions and galvanizing the people behind certain causes, many of that takes into consideration avoiding litigation. And I am just curious to what extent you think litigation may be used as a tool for change. So we have so many different litigation movements in this country right now, from state tort claims to the Children's Trust and Atmospheric Trust claims, and litigation challenging agency decisions under climate change. And then obviously we had the devastation of West Virginia v. EPA, but maybe that opens up the federal tort realm again. So, I mean, just to what extent do you think avoiding litigation is a good thing? And then within that kind of conception, do you think there's room to use litigation as a tool to affect positive change, even if all it is like a protest?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question, and an important question, because these voluntary processes, environmental dispute resolution, can rarely, if ever, be precedent setting, right? And so there is a place for litigation and a need for it. Also, you're not always going to get people to the table or hold people accountable through a process that's voluntary. So you would need the backdrop of or threat of litigation there to motivate people. I talked about motivations, like hopefully you don't want people to participate because of that threat of litigation, but unfortunately it does motivate people sometimes and require them to change. So that threat can be leveraged to make progress in a voluntary process. But I think the most important piece of that would be that, you need litigation to set precedent.
Thank you very much. I think we have one more. From the chat, do you anticipate any new types of environmental disputes that will materialize here in the near future as we kind of progress through our climate and biodiversity crises, things that you may anticipate but haven't dealt with before?
I guess the simple answer would be yes, absolutely. The way we manage conflict or deal with change should always be evolving. So I'd say, absolutely. With technology, just over the last 4 years, as we can see right now, there are different ways to engage. We'll probably leverage that, utilize that more. Ways to make decisions with AI will probably influence that as well. Absolutely.
Excellent. And I do have one more, actually. It's a personal question. I've been told that environmental lawyers don't golf, they fly fish. Can you confirm that?
Yeah, I can confirm that.
Excellent. Well, I will work on my angling.
Yeah,
Josh, we can't
shouldn't
thank you
golf
enough.
'cause, they got to conserve the water. Can't waste it on golf courses.
Amen, Josh. Preach. We can't thank you enough for joining us tonight.
You're welcome. Thanks, Daniel.
I'm going to embarrass you for a second. Most of you are probably unaware, but we had a panelist drop out this past weekend, and upon receiving a cold call on Monday, Josh generously agreed to give us his time. He did it on a whim with a few days' notice, and that was very generous and outstanding. And Josh, the information and advice that you shared with us tonight is invaluable, and you're a true highlight. Let's give Josh a special thanks.
Thanks, Daniel. Well done. Appreciate it.
Thank you. We'd like to extend a big thank you to all of our speakers tonight who took time from their busy schedules to speak with us and share their expertise. Everyone here in attendance is lucky to have your professional insights, and the advocates in the audience will carry your wisdom with them as we strive to save the world. We'd also like to thank everyone in the audience, both in person and online, who joined us to learn and ask insightful questions. We hope to see you again next year. Good night and good luck.